Chapter 9 Externalities and Public Goods. How can the Queen of England lower her commute time to Wembley Stadium? Imagine yourself sitting in your economics classroom waiting for the start of class. You're chatting with your neighbors about how free trade might not be so bad after all. And other students are buzzing about the power of the invisible hand as they search for their preferred seats. Your professor strolls in with her usual materials in tow, but something unusual is clutched in her right hand. After seeing down her bag, she takes out a match from a matchbox. Confidently, she strikes the match and lights up the cigar in her right hand. One student gasps, another shrieks in delight. Your economics professor is smoking a cigar in class. Students, welcome to the world of externalities, your professor says boldly. You might ask yourself, how do externalities fit in the markets we have studied thus far? In short, they don't. So far, in our study of markets, we have focused solely on buyers and sellers who are the only ones affected by the market transaction. But we know that many times the action of one party affect the well-being of countless other parties, like people smoking cigars or factories belching out smoke. In situations like these, the invisible hand may fail to allocate resources efficiently. For instance, many people may suffer from a polluting factory's emissions without ever benefiting from the production that caused the pollution. Chapter Outline 9.1 Externalities 9.2 Private Solution to Externalities 9.3 Government Solution to Externalities 9.4 Public Goods 9.5 Common Pool Resource Goods EBE. How can the Queen of England lower her commute time to Wembley Stadium? Key ideas. There are important cases in which free market fail to maximize social surplus. This chapter discusses three cases: externalities, public goods, and common pool resources. One common link between these three examples is that there is a difference between the private benefits and costs and the social benefits and costs. Government can play a role in improving market outcomes in such cases. Economists call such examples externalities. And externalities occur when there is a spillover from one person's action to a bystander. If left alone, people will generally not account for how their actions affect others, whether positive or negative. For instance, think about automobiles for a minute. They not only contribute to the global warming problem but also create traffic congestions. But have you ever chosen not to drive a car because of the extra congestion that your vehicle will cause? Neither have we, and this is the crux of why such externalities are called market failures. In this chapter, we will see that in the case of externalities, governments can enact policies to push market outcomes toward a greater level of social well being. For example, one possible policy to alleviate traffic jams is to impose a fee on automobile drivers using particular roads. It's precisely that proposal that we'll examine in our evidence based economics feature at the end of the chapter, which will help us to answer the opening question about lowering Queen's commute time. A related example of when the free market fails to arrive at a socially efficient outcome if left alone is in the provision of public goods, such as national defense, or in the protection of common pool resources, such as open access lake. The link between all three of these market failures is that there is a difference between social and private benefits or social and private costs, causing the individual to face different incentives than society faces. Accordingly, much like the case with externalities, we will find that government can play a critical role in providing public goods and protecting common pool resources. 9.1 Externalities. It's morning and you wake up to an alarm clock buzzing. You roll out of bed, walk to the bathroom, flip on the light, and turn on the shower. Hot water bursts out, and the exhaust fan ensures that shower area remains fog free. You haven't have been awake only for 15 minutes on this day, but you already have made use of electricity 4 times: the alarm clock, the bathroom light, the water heater, and the ceiling fan. Electricity obviously benefits all of us in many ways, but the power company incurs production costs to provide electricity. As we learned earlier, the market arrives at a price for electricity that reflects both of these factors, marginal benefits and marginal costs. In Exhibit 9.1, we make the assumption that the electricity industry is a perfectly competitive market. The market demand curve in the exhibit shows consumers' willingness and ability to pay for electricity, and the market supply curve reflects producers' marginal cost of generating it. As we learned in Chapter 7, it is at the equilibrium point where these two lines intersect that the invisible hand most efficiently allocates resource, the point at which social surplus is maximized. Exhibit 9.1, the market for electricity. The downward sloping market demand curve intersects the upward sloping market supply curve to determine the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity of electricity. But what Exhibit 9.1 does not show is that when producing electricity, plants typically emit nasty pollutants including sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides, which can cause lung irritation, bronchitis, and pneumonia. You can also you also cannot see in a graph like this that at high dosage levels the mercury released from the coal burning power plant has been linked to the bird defects. Global warming has also been linked to pollutants emitted from power plants. In economic terms, the power plants impose an externality on the public as a byproduct of producing electricity. An externality occurs when an economic activity has either a spillover cost or a spillover benefit on a bystander. In this case, the plant is imposing a negative externality because by producing electricity, it creates a spillover cost that it does not consider when making production decisions. Because the owner of the plant do not have to pay for the cost that plant imposes on society, they do not take into account the health or discomfort of citizenry in their production decisions. That is, free market allocates the resources in a way that ignores these negative externalities. Many firms pollute when they produce goods for us to consume. A broken invisible hand. Negative externalities. Let's return to Exhibit 9.1, where we show the market demand and the market supply curves for electricity. We can ask ourselves, why is this outcome efficient? The answer is that it is efficient because at that point social surplus is maximized. Every buyer who is willing and able to pay the equilibrium price for electricity ends up, in fact, consuming electricity. And because plants expand production until MC is equal to MR is equal to P, social surplus is maximized. Both consumer and producers do as well as they can in equilibrium. When there are negative externalities present, however, this market outcome is no longer efficient. This is because negative externalities impose an additional cost on society that is not explicitly recognized by the buyers and sellers in the market. For electricity generation, these additional costs come from pollution, a byproduct of electricity production. In computing the efficient outcome, we must adjust the supply curve to take account of the negative externalities or external cost. That is, as we discussed in Chapter 6, the supply curve is the marginal cost curve for the firm and includes a plant's expenditures for inputs such as labor. The external costs that society bears as a result of the plant's pollution are ignored. However, to arrive at the efficient production level, we need to recognize both the firm's marginal cost and the marginal external costs of production. Together, they sum to the marginal social cost of production. So, what does this mean for the efficient level of output? Exhibit 9.2 reveals that at each level of production, we must include both marginal cost of the plant to produce plus the marginal external cost of the pollution. This new curve is called the marginal social cost or MSC. because it includes both the marginal cost of the firm and the marginal external cost imposed on the society. MSC equals to marginal cost plus marginal external cost. Recall that the original supply curve is the marginal cost curve of the electricity producer. The MSC is therefore the marginal cost of the externality plus this marginal cost. Taking into account the extra cost imposed on the society by the plant's pollution, we can see that Q optimal is less than Q market, because when a negative externality must be accounted for, a smaller quantity of electricity should be generated since it is now more costly to produce each unit. Thus, in case where there are negative externalities, market, if left alone, will produce too much, resulting in too much pollution. Exhibit 9.2, the socially optimal quantity and price of electricity. Negative externalities lead to the external cost of production that the private firm will not account for when making decision. The marginal external cost is the vertical distance between supply and marginal social cost. If we take the marginal external cost into account, a higher equilibrium price and a lower equilibrium quantity result. Negative externalities impose an additional cost on society that is not explicitly recognized by the buyers and the sellers in the market. You might wonder just how much this negative externality costs society. We can explore this question graphically by considering Exhibit 9.3. Let's begin with the equilibrium quantity level Q market is equal 400 billion kilowatt hours. In the free market, this is the unit of production that equates marginal willingness to pay with the marginal cost of producing that unit of electricity. That is, $0.20 is equal to $0.20. But with the negative externalities, we see that the marginal social cost is $0.30 for the last unit, not $0.20. This means that by producing that last unit, we actually cause social well-being to go down by $0.10, which is $0.30 minus $0.20. The marginal social cost from producing the last unit minus the marginal benefit from producing the last unit. This means that if we do not produce that last unit, we will save $0.10. Recall from chapter 7 that dead weight loss is a decrease in social surplus that results from a market distortion. If producing that last unit caused by a dead weight loss of $0.10, what is the total dead weight loss associated with the externality? Exhibit 9.3, deadweight loss due to a negative externality. In producing the last unit of production of a deadweight loss of $0.10 resulted. Doing a similar exercise for all units produced to the right of the social optimal production level, we can graphically represent the deadweight loss as a yellow triangle. Extending the reasoning from the last unit produced to all units produced between Q optimal and Q market, we arrive at yellow shaded region in Exhibit 9.3. This is the area between marginal costs, marginal social cost curve and the market demand curve between units Q optimal and Q market. The triangle represents the sum of the losses for each unit, the difference between the total marginal cost and total marginal benefits to society as a whole. Thus, the yellow shaded triangle represent the dead weight loss of negative externalities. As a way to check your work, the dead weight loss is usually in the form of a triangle with the arrow pointing in the direction that society would prefer. In the case depicted in Exhibit 9.3, the arrow of the triangle points leftward, meaning society prefers less production than free market provides. One important feature of this discussion is that pollution is not driven to zero. That is not the goal. Rather, the optimal solution calls for us to recognize the marginal cost of pollution, externality to society. Upon recognizing the marginal external cost, as in the example, it is often the case that we are left with some pollution. This is for two main reasons. Pollutants in moderate dosages are in many cases not very damaging, and it is very costly to produce some good without releasing any pollution. A broken invisible hand. Positive externalities. There are important situations that are a mirror image of negative externalities, that is, positive externalities, which occur when an economic activity has a spillover benefit that is not considered when people make their own decisions. As with negative externalities, positive externalities are all around us. For instance, a resident of Sarasota who landscapes her property will probably enhance the value of her neighbor's property, even though they had nothing to do with the decision to landscape. Another important example of a positive externality is educational attainment, which not only helps a student through better employment opportunities and higher wages but also confers significant benefits on others. These benefits can come in many forms, but the ones most often cited are the following. First, education often increases civic engagement, thereby contributing to a more informed democratic society. Second, an educated workforce is vital for innovation and adoption of new technologies. An educated citizenry will be less likely to commit crime. Among economists and policymakers, the positive externality argument is commonly cited justification for government involvement in education. To show why, let's begin with Exhibit 9.4, which illustrates the market demand and market supply curves for education. For clarity, let's continue with the assumption that education is a perfectly competitive market. Therefore, Q market is efficient outcome. With no externalities, the invisible hand is driving the market to an efficient equilibrium. In the case of positive externalities, however, the invisible hand does not yield socially efficient results. This is because positive externalities create external social benefits that are reaped by others. Exhibit 9.5 reveals an example of positive externalities, which can be thought of as the difference between the demand curve, which is the marginal benefit, and the marginal social benefit MSB curve. Therefore, the MSB curve is the marginal private benefit plus the marginal external benefit. MSB equals to marginal benefit plus marginal external benefit. Consider Exhibit 9.5 more closely. The efficient amount of education from the viewpoint of society is given by Q optimal. This is where society's marginal benefit from another unit of education equals to the marginal cost of producing that unit of education. But this won't be the same as the equilibrium quantity in a free market. The education industry will only produce until its marginal costs equal the private demand for education, not the social demand. This is because the industry can only sell its output to education buyers. For practical reasons, it cannot charge people who enjoy the external benefit of education production, those people who benefit from a more informed citizenry or less crime, for example. We can now see the inefficiency created by not recognizing the positive externalities, even though there are years of education from which the marginal social benefits are greater than the marginal cost to produce. These years are never produced and consumed. As a result, the market quantity will be too low relatively to the social efficient level as seen in Exhibit 9.5, resulting in a deadweight loss. We can compute the dead weight loss in much the same way as we did in the case of negative externalities. Consider Exhibit 9.5 once again. Let's begin with the equilibrium quantity level Q market. In the free market, this was the unit of production that equated willingness to pay for that unit of education with the marginal cost of producing that unit of education. $40,000 equals to $40,000. But with the positive externalities, we see that the marginal benefit to the society is $60,000. $40,000 private plus $20,000 external benefits for the last unit of education that was purchased. This means that if we would produce that last unit, we would increase the social well-being by $20,000. The marginal social benefit of the last unit minus the marginal cost of the last unit. In fact, with a higher marginal benefit due to positive externalities, we see that we should keep producing because the marginal gains to society are greater than the marginal costs to produce. This reasoning continues until we reach the point Q optimal. The amount of economic benefit that could be gained if we produce the optimal quantity is shown in the yellow shaded region of the exhibit. This is the area between the marginal social benefit curve and the marginal cost curve between Q market to Q optimal. The area reflects how much society could increase social surplus if it produced at the efficient level. Again, you will notice that deadweight loss takes the form of a triangle with the arrow pointing in the direction that society would prefer. Choice and consequences. Positive externalities in sports you never imagined. Externalities are the result of agents trying to do the best they can and ignoring how their action affect others. In this sense, it would be wrong to think of externalities as mistakes. Externalities may result from just not knowing the harm we cause others. In this case, we might make choices that we later regret. Consider the case of flu vaccination. When you make the decision of whether or not to be vaccinated against the flu, you likely consider only the private benefits and the costs from the vaccination, namely the benefits or cost to yourself. But you are not the only person to incur benefits or cost. If you decide to take the flu shot, others gain. Once you are vaccinated, they are now protected against catching the flu from you. But people can also lose if you choose not to get the shot because you could catch the flu and spread it. Many of us would not take such externalities, whether positive or negative, into the account when making a decision about whether to get a flu shot. But they nevertheless exist. Researchers who have studied the externalities of vaccinations report quite large effects. For instance, in certain situations, the external effects of you getting a flu shot can be as high as 1.5 infection. Given that approximately 10% to 20% of the US population contracts the flu each year, this estimate reveals the potential value in flu vaccination programs. If you find it important to take account of your own externalities the next time you are weighing your private benefits and cost of getting a flu vaccine, remember that not getting a shot could result in as many as 1.5 more infection for everyone else. In this sense, by avoiding the needle, you have imposed a greater externality on the rest of the population, even some of those who have gotten the shot. Pecuniary externalities. You might be thinking as you read this chapter that every market action has an externality. For example, if millions of new consumers decide to buy iPods, market demand will shift rightwards, increasing price. If you were planning on buying an iPod, these consumers have just imposed a negative externality on you. This is a good intuition. Every market does have this type of externalities, at least in the short run. Economists think of this kind of externality as a different animal compared to the externality examples above. The two types of externalities we have just studied have much different application. They create market inefficiency. The example of more people buying a good and thereby causing a negative market impact for others is called pecuniary externality. Pecuniary externalities exist when market transactions affect other people but only through the market price. This defining attribute of pecuniary externalities, that they act only through prices, is critically important. It means that pecuniary externalities do not create market inefficiency. Here's why. Remember that negative and positive externalities lead to wrong equilibrium quantities. They do so because they create an external cost or external benefit that is not reflected in the market price. Pecuniary externalities don't create these effects precisely because their impact is completely embedded in prices. The market price correctly reflects the society wide impact of market transactions. You could say that pecuniary externalities are necessary for efficient markets because as goods more become more or less scarce, their price should change. Negative and positive externalities such as pollution and education cause market inefficiencies because goods are either over or underproduced and consumed. A pecuniary externality occurs when a market transaction affects other people only through market prices. 9.2 Private solution to externalities. When externalities are present, the market outcome is inefficient. Exhibit 9.3 and 9.5 in the previous section reveal the inefficiency of not taking externalities into account. Conceptually, the exhibits show the following two important things. First, when there are negative externalities present, free market produce and consume too much. When there are positive externalities present, free market produce and consume too little. If, in the presence of negative externalities, too much of a good is being produced, and in the presence of positive externalities, too little of a good is being produced, then how does society achieve a more efficient outcome? Several possibilities have emerged. Some involve private citizens working it out themselves, while others include government intervention. In this section, we consider a number of private solutions. One fundamental theme unites the multiple solutions to externalities, whether public goods or private, whether public or private, internalizing the externality. When individual or companies take into account the full cost and benefit of their actions because of some public or private incentive, economists say that they are internalizing the externality. When the external effects of their action are internalized, the general result is that the market equilibrium moves towards higher social well being. To understand how internalizing the externality works in the area of private solution, we'll consider the scenario of a power plant that is currently emitting tons of toxin in waterways, and this adversely affects local fishermen. Place yourself in the seat of a city mayor and think about when you would do if the fishermen came clamoring to you for help in curbing the plant's emission. Your first thought might be to read the city pollution ordinances to check if there is a law against polluting the waterways. Say that upon doing so, you find that there is no such regulation. The power plant has right to pollute for free. Thus, in actuality, the power plant has the right to pollute. Amazing. Your next thought might be to impose laws that establish new regulation on the power plant. This is most people's first instinct because a common misperception is that government is the only source of change when in fact private organizations have affected change for years. Such private solutions to externality problems usually require parties to negotiate with one another or social enforcement mechanism to be in place. Let's see how bargaining can work. Private solution bargaining. To gain a sense of how bargaining can work, we'll continue with the power plant and fisherman example. Say you discover the power plant can eliminate the toxin that it emits by purchasing and installing scrubbers, a technology that cleans water and air before they are released into the ecosystem. But scrubbers are expensive to purchase and maintain. The best cost estimate is that over the next decade, the cost of necessary scrubbers will be $5 million. However, because the power plant holds the right to pollute by law, it does not have to install expensive equipment. On the other side of the equation are the fishermen. Their scientists tell them that pollution has gotten to such dangerous levels that there is a chance of entire fishing industry could be shut down within a matter of years. Their analysis further tells them that the power plant is, in fact, the main culprit, emitting tons of toxin into the waterways weekly. The fishermen conclude that if they can convince the power plant to install the scrubbers, they'll receive benefits over the next decade of approximately $7 million. In this case, what is the outcome if the fishermen and the power plant do not communicate? Left to itself, the power plant is clearly not interested in spending $5 million on scrubbers because it does not gain from such a purchase. As you can see, this market outcome is not socially efficient because total well being could be increased. In fact, the amount of money left on the table is $2 million. That is $7 million minus $5 million. You might recall from chapter 8 that you can think of this as the gains to trade. So, does this mean that pollution will continue at the current rate because the power plant has the legal right to do what it desires? Can economics help solve this impasse? As it turns out, economics does play a critical role. Legal rights do not have to be the deciding factor. A private deal can be struck. How can we be so sure? You note that fishermen are willing to pay up to $7 million to rid the waterways of the power plant's pollution, whereas it costs the power plant only $5 million to abate pollution. Therefore, a deal will be brokered in which the fisherman given an amount of money between $5 million and $7 million to the plant, and the power plant install and maintain the scrubbers. What is not clear is exactly in the $5 million to $7 million price range the deal will be struck, as was observed in chapter 8 about the range of possible terms of trade. Now let's consider when the opposite case is at work. Upon looking into the local audiences, say that you had found that there was a law against the power plant polluting the waterways. You would have then informed the power plant that it was out of compliance. If it chose at that point not to shut down, it would then have installed the scrubbers, thereby eliminating the water pollution. The remarkable bottom line is that regardless of whether the law permits the power plant to pollute or not, the economically efficient outcome is achieved either way. The plants install and maintain scrubbers because abating pollution provides the highest social value. The Coase theorem. This insight that negotiation leads to the socially efficient outcome regardless of who has the legal property right, ownership of property or resources, is called Coase theorem after the Nobel laureate economist who proposed it, Ronald Coase. The theorem's implication is powerful. Private bargaining will lead to an efficient allocation of resources. This means that the person who values ownership the most will end up owning the property right. The end result of the Coase theorem then is that government intervention is not necessary to solve externality problem. Private bargaining can do the job. Although we reach the efficient outcome regardless of initial property rights, who holds the initial property rights is not irrelevant. This is because the initial property right allocation is an important determinant of the distribution of surplus. That said, we should be cautious about relying too much on the private solution to externalities for the following reason. First, the assumption that the parties involved, those creating the externalities and those suffering from it, can negotiate economically is critically important. This means that as long as the transaction costs associated with negotiating aren't too high, the efficient economic outcome can be achieved. Whether the property right is clearly defined is important. In many cases, the law is not clear who holds it. The number of agents on each side of bargaining table matters. It's not easy to imagine that bargaining can lead to an efficient solution with a small number of affected people, but it is more difficult to see how such bargaining could work between, say, a power plant and 1 lakh affected fishermen. The Coase theorem applied to this situation would say that whether the plant has the right to pollute or the 1 lakh fishermen have the right to clean water, the end result will be efficient amount of water quality. If the plant does have the right to pollute, then 1 lakh fishermen must coordinate on how to pay the plant to cut back its emission. If the fishermen have the right to clean water, then the power plant will have to pay them to be able to emit the pollution if that is efficient solution. But as a practical matter, it is difficult for 1 lakh fishermen to somehow negotiate their own agreements with a plant about the allowable level of emission and who gets compensated. In this case, a governmental rule might be the most efficient means to address the externality. This is because the transaction costs associated with the bargaining might not be too high. Hence, even when property rights are perfectly established, the cost of bargaining itself, the transaction cost associated with the making an economic exchange, might be too high to permit this sort of arrangement from happening. This transaction cost not only include direct expenditures such as legal fees and your time, but also the cost of an awkward situation. It might be difficult to walk to next door and bargain with your neighbor about the amount of dog droppings his pet can leave on your front yard. With this in mind, we turn to a second popular private means to address the market failure of externalities: social enforcement mechanism. Private solution: doing the right thing. Does the logo to the left look familiar? If you have seen it on your kitchen appliances, your computer, or your Windows, you have approved energy efficient products. The Energy Star program is a joint program introduced in 1992 by US Environmental Protection Agency (EPA) and the US Department of Energy to promote energy efficient products. Energy Star is a voluntary labeling program designed to identify and promote energy efficient products to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The first kind of products to be labeled Energy Star were computers and monitors. The program now includes over 60 product categories, including major appliances, office equipment, lighting, and home electronics. Today, you can hardly miss the sticker when entering a workplace. The Energy Star program has worked both because there are financial incentives associated with the products, reduced electricity cost and potential tax savings, and because it involves a social enforcement mechanism. It gives us information about green products and invokes a moral code that you should do the right thing and purchase them. There are no official government regulation that tell people that they have to buy Energy Star products, but the substantial growth in the program since 1992 is a testament to the power of motivating people to try to do their part for the environment. In economic language, the moral code of doing one's part is internalizing externalities. Once you give it some thought, you realize that social enforcement mechanisms are operating all around us and help us to take account of our externalities. For instance, we will learn in the later in this chapter that private organizations such as the Sierra Club are quite successful at protecting the environment. The charity Smile Train does incredible work with overseas children who have palates. Closer to home, when waiting in line for a ride at Disney World or in a supermarket checkout line, we rarely observe people line jumping. People generally refrain from the practice not because there is a stiff financial penalty for doing so, but because their action will likely to be frowned upon by the people who bear the cost of their rudeness. Such socially imposed costs lead to a reduction in the quantity of line jumping to the net benefit of society. Shame, guilt, and the risk that we will be publicly decried are all effective social enforcement mechanisms. In particular, all of these social controls help to internalize the negative externalities imposed on them, leading to less of such behavior. Although private solution can provide quite effective direct might government intervention might be necessary when private interventions fail. Such solutions usually take the form of rules that restrict production in some form, taxation, or requiring permits for production. We consider several examples of government solution to externalities. 9.3 Government Solutions to Externalities. There are many ways in which market fail or at least fall short of the ideal competitive market outcomes described in Exhibit 9.1 and 9.4. Whenever market fails, policymakers need to consider the following question: can the government bring about a particular outcome more efficiently than the market? We have learned that there are potentially important private solutions to externalities, including bargaining over outcomes and relying on social enforcement mechanisms. Yet these also are apt to fall short in certain situations. Government respond to externalities in two main ways: command and control policies, in which government directly regulates the allocation of resources. Second, market based policies, in which the government provides incentives for private organization to internalize externality. Let's return to the case of power plants' release of pollutants. Suppose the plant also emits the air pollutant that affects millions of households in the neighboring states. In such a case, the costs are dispersed in a manner that makes private negotiations almost impossible. Put yourself in the shoes of the federal regulator and think about what you would do in the case. A situation in which you are certain that curbing the pollutant emission from the plant will be beneficial to society, you will find yourself relying on the two major approaches just listed, to which we now turn into more detail. Government regulation, command and control policies. If you knew that curbing emission would benefit society, then you realize that Q market greater than Q optimal, and an approach to lower the quantity produced and thereby pollution is a step in the right direction. One common approach for solving this problem is by using command and control regulation. Under command and control regulation, policymakers either directly restrict the level of production or mandate the use of certain technologies. Many early environmental regulations, including the landmark Clean Water and Clean Air legislation of the 1970s, were command and control regulations. In this case, the government required polluters to adopt the best available pollution reducing technologies. For example, the Clean Water Act stipulated exactly the types of technologies that each plant had to install if they were to continue operation. Similar regulations can be found in the various Clean Air Acts amendment. For example, under the 1977 Clean Air Act amendments, new polluting plants had to install certain abatement technologies. As you might have guessed, there are many ways to regulate polluters, and the command and control technique might not be the most efficient course of regulatory action to curb pollution. For one thing, this type of regulatory action typically provides few incentives for producers to search for more cost effective ways to reduce pollution itself. This happens because regulators have directed attention to the wrong target. They mandate the technology that producers must use. This pushes the producer to develop efficient methods to use the mandated technology. Yet, rather than focusing producer efforts on developing cheaper ways to use the mandated technology, the regulators should incentivize producers to find or develop the most cost effective technologies. Government regulation, market based approach. Given that you are interested in efficient regulation, you decide not to make use of the command and control approach and instead turn to a market based regulatory approach. A market based approach internalizes externalities by harnessing the power of market forces. What does this mean in terms of power plant scenario? With the market based approach, the method for reducing pollution is essentially left to the emitter, the power plant itself. Thus, there is greater incentive to develop new ways to reduce pollution than in the command and control approach. A market based regulatory approach internalizes externalities by harnessing the power of market forces. Corrective taxes and subsidies. The most prominent market based approach to dealing with externalities are corrective taxes and subsidies. Let's return to the case of local power plant. Because its production is creating a negative externality, it is producing too much. So, you want the power plant to cut back on production because doing so moves the quantity produced towards the efficient level. You can do this through taxes on the production from the plant. Such government taxes are called corrective tax or Pigouvian taxes, named after the economics Arthur Pigou, a pioneer in describing how such taxes would work. A corrective tax is a tax designed to induce agents who produce negative externalities to reduce quantity toward the social optimal level. Given that you understand there is an externality, what should you do? Your first step is to estimate the marginal external cost. Economists have developed tools to help policymakers calculate such costs. And below in the letting the data speak box, we discuss one example. In this case, let's assume that the policymakers estimate the marginal external costs as given in Exhibit 9.6. The next step is to levy a corrective tax in the amount to reduce the equilibrium quantity to social optimum. That is, you levy a per unit tax equal to the marginal external cost of the externalities, which is $0.10 per unit, as shown in Exhibit 9.6. Because the level of the tax is equal to the difference between the S and MSE, plants now choose a profit maximizing output that is equal to the Q optimal. Looked at in other way, the Pigouvian tax creates a virtual market supply curve that is identical to the MSC curve by having each plant consider the externality when making production choices. They consider the externality because they account for the corrective tax when making their production decisions. Thus, the tax exactly aligns private and society's incentives. In effect, the correction tax internalizes the pollution externality. This results in efficient market outcomes. The same reasoning that holds for negative externality also applies to the positive externalities. The government can use corrective subsidies or Pigouvian subsidies to internalize the externality. A corrective subsidy is designed to induce agents who produce positive externalities to increase quantity towards the socially optimal level. In the case of positive externalities, a subsidy is used to correct the externality. Let's return to the case of education, which is shown in Exhibit 9.7. In this case, what should you do? Much like when there is a negative externality, you need to first estimate the marginal social benefit of education. Upon doing so, the next step is to levy a corrective subsidy in this amount to increase the equilibrium quantity to the social optimum. That is, you levy a per unit subsidy equal to the marginal social benefit of the externalities, which is $20,000 per year. As shown in Exhibit 9.7, this is the difference between D and MSB. Again, because the level of subsidy is equal to the difference, individuals now have an incentive to choose the socially efficient level of education or Q optimum. In this manner, the Pigouvian subsidy creates a virtual demand curve that is identical to MSB curve by having individuals consider the externality when making their education choices. You consider the externality because when deciding whether to obtain more years or schooling, you take the account of corrective subsidy. Thus, the subsidy exactly aligns your and society's incentives. In effect, the corrective subsidy internalizes the positive externality. This results in the efficient market outcome. As you likely as you likely know firsthand, such incentives are often put to use in practice. The federal government subsidizes education tremendously, beginning in the pre-kindergarten classes and up through the PhD. The creative ways in which such government subsidies are structured range from funding public education to special government college scholarships to highly subsidized school loans. All of these occurs because the government is trying to encourage education in an attempt to correct the market failure that occurs when you make your educational choices. In sum, externalities potentially drive a wedge between social benefits and costs and private benefits and costs. This wedge creates a distortion, deadweight loss, if the free market equilibrium quantity levels diverge from the social optimum quantity levels. Corrective taxes and subsidies can cause agents to internalize their externalities. In using such taxes, the government raises tax revenues, but that is not its main goal. Rather, it is attempting to align private and social incentives. To do so, it critically relies on estimates of externalities. A vibrant area of research within economics continues to develop to estimate the cost and benefits of externalities. How would you estimate the dollar value of externalities? Letting the data speak. How to value externalities. A key challenge to policymakers is estimating the external cost or benefits of an activity. For instance, in the case of air pollution from the local power plant, how do policymakers know the cost of lower air quality? One approach is to examine how prices of goods that trade in markets are affected by air quality. This is exactly what economists Kenneth K. and Michael Greenstone did to evaluate the value of cleaning up of various types of air pollution after Clean Air Act of 1970. Before 1970, there was a little federal regulation of air pollution, and the issue was not high on the agenda of state legislature. As a result, many counties allowed factories to operate without any regulation on their pollution, and in several heavy industrialized counties, pollution had reached very high levels. In particular, in many urban areas, air pollution, as measured by the amount of total suspended particle, had reached dangerous levels. The Clean Air Act established guidelines for what constituted excessively high levels of five particularly dangerous pollutants. And according to these guidelines, the Environmental Protection Agency and the states would enforce reductions in total suspended particle quantities in counties that were in non-compliant status. Following the act in 1970 and the 1977 amendment that strengthened the implementation of the act, requiring any increasing emissions coming from a new investment to be offset by reduction in emissions from other sources in the same county. There were improvements in the air quality, again gauged by the total suspended particle measure. K and Greenstone then investigate how housing prices change in the counties where, because of the Clean Air Act, there was a large improvement in air quality. They find significant improvements in the house prices and no appreciable change in average county incomes. As a result, they estimate that there was approximately $45 billion aggregate increase in housing values because of Clean Air Act. Policymakers make use of such estimate to help guide their choices of corrective taxes and subsidies. Letting the data speak. Pay as you throw. Consumers create negative externalities too. If you have any roommates, you're probably well aware of a perfect setting for Pigouvian tax trash. In particular, you and your roommate probably out lots of stuff, and when the trash can gets full, it's often a lot of work to carry the bag of trash out to the dumpster or the trash can. Sometimes roommates anticipate this cost and just let the trash in the can pile higher and higher. Ultimately, someone has to take it out. Though, and there is often no great mechanism to incentivize this behavior, cities have a similar problem, but on a much more massive scale. Namely, people buy and throw out tons of stuff, and disposing of all that trash isn't free. In an attempt to reduce this waste and the cost it imposes, cities have adopted Pigouvian taxes that have been called as pay as you throw. These programs charge people a small price for each bag of trash that they produce. That price, of course, is the cost to the city for disposing of each bag, and in theory, this sort of tax should move people to internalize the cost of their behavior in the city. Pay as you throw programs have been run in 4,032 communities in 43 states, covering about 10% of the population in the United States. And the overwhelming conclusion is that these programs reduce the amount of trash people throw out. One survey of the communities suggests that moving to a pay as you throw program reduced household trash by more than a ton per year. This reduction comes in part from a reduction in waste creation but also an increase in recycling. All told, the Pigouvian tax on trash does seem to accomplish what Pigou theorized so long ago, that with a corrective tax, consumer decision will start to move towards social optimum. 9.4 Public Goods. Many people from the Midwest are familiar with the blare of a tornado siren signaling that a funnel cloud is swirling towards their city. Once the siren sounds, no one can exclude others from hearing it, and one person hearing the siren does not affect the ability of others to hear it. These two properties, that no one can prevent others from consumption and that one person's consumption doesn't prevent another person's consumption, distinguish public goods. They are different from the goods we have studied so far, private goods, which are traded in the markets where buyers and sellers meet, and if they agree on the price, ownership is transferred. To understand the nature of a public good, it is useful to compare and contrast public goods and private goods in more detail. There are two characteristics that differentiate them. First, excludability. Private goods are excludable, meaning that people can be kept from consuming them if they have not paid for them. Public goods are non excludable, meaning that once they are produced, it is not possible to exclude people from using them. Rivalry in consumption. Private goods are rival in consumption, meaning that they cannot be consumed by more than one person at a time. Public goods are non rival in consumption, meaning that one person's consumption does not preclude consumption by others. To summarize, we can say that private goods are excludable and rival in consumption, and public goods are non excludable and non rival in consumption. We provide Exhibit 9.8 to aid in our thinking about different types of goods in the economy based on their degree of excludability and rivalry. Let's look at the four categories of good in the exhibit in more detail. First, ordinary private goods, shown in the upper left corner of Exhibit 9.8, are both highly excludable and highly rival in consumption. Think about a Snickers candy bar that you have just purchased at the bookstore. Once you purchase and eat that specific candy bar, no one else can. You have perfectly excluded others from buying that particular Snickers. Thus, your consumption has reduced the ability of another person to consume the candy bar. In fact, your consumption has created a one to one reduction in the Snickers bar available to others. A large fraction of the goods and services that we buy and sell in the market economy have these same properties. And that is why we have implicitly assumed that this to be the case when the modeling demand and supply in previous chapters. Second, in the lower left corner of the exhibit, we find another category of goods, those that are highly excludable but non rival in consumption. We call such excludable non rival goods club goods. Economists also commonly refer to them as artificially scarce goods. For instance, perhaps after you read this chapter, you will turn on the television to watch your favorite cable television show. In doing so, you will not affect the ability of others to watch the same show. Therefore, cable TV is a non rival good because many people can watch at the same time without disrupting the ability of others to watch. However, individuals can be excluded from watching cable TV if they do not pay for the service. Thus, it is a good uh, ex- that is excludable. Club goods present a bit of a conundrum when sold as private good. They are non-rival, so the marginal cost of producing one extra unit is small, perhaps even zero, but they tend to require large fixed costs like wiring cable around the world for cable TV. If sold at marginal cost, firms would never cover the large fixed costs they bear. Consumers oftentimes have a positive willingness to pay for such goods, though as a result, club goods typically are not sold in perfectly competitive markets. Third, the upper right corner shows a category of goods called common pool resource goods, which are non excludable but rival in consumption. For instance, an open access lake is available to all fishermen, but the fish they catch can not be caught by another fisherman and thus are rival. Likewise, if you are at a picnic, what happens when the hamburgers run out? You are left with your second choice, a hot dog. We discuss this type of goods in further detail later in the chapter. Fourth, a much different class of goods appears in the lower right corner of the exhibit, public goods. Recall that they are the goods that are non rival in consumption and are non excludable. Considering protecting the earth from climate change, governments around the world spend billions of dollars annually to curb the harmful greenhouse gases. Even if people fail to pay their taxes to support such environmental programs, government cannot exclude them from enjoying the benefits. That is, while cable television is an excludable good, enjoying Earth's comfort climate is not. National defense and local warning systems are other example of public goods that we enjoy daily. Public goods present particular problems for the markets to provide because consumers do not see the value proposition in buying them. When purchasing in Nintendo DS, it is clear what you get for $100. What are you getting if you send in $100 to the US government for national defense? You will be protected by the Defense Department regardless of whether you have sent cash or not. And because your $100 make no appreciable difference between a successful and unsuccessful national defense system, you likely will not send in $100 in the first place. Why send $100 to the US government and receive little in return when you can send the same $100 to Amazon and get a Nintendo DS game system? This example represents a key problem with efficiently providing public goods. We want them, but we aren't willing to pay for them because we can't be excluded from consuming them once they are provided. And the same is true for everyone. Thus, public goods suffer from what economists call a free rider problem, in which a person has no incentive to pay for a good because failure to pay doesn't prevent consumption. Free riders either consume more than their fair share or pay less than their fair share of its cost. Such cases represent situations in which government intervention can potentially raise social surplus. But how much of the public good should the government provide if it wants to maximize social purpose? Are there other ways to provide it? We turn to these questions now. Government provision of public goods. What makes public goods different from private goods is precisely their non rival and non excludable nature. Their non excludability represents a distinct opportunity for the government to step in and provide them because it can levy taxes for their provision. Standard cost benefit logic applies to the case of providing public goods. The government should expand production until the marginal benefits equal marginal costs. That is, if the marginal benefits exceed the marginal cost of providing the next unit, it should be provided. Conceptually, we can calculate the optimal level of public goods provision once we know the market demand curve and the marginal cost associated with providing various level of a public good. To construct the market demand curve, we must first know the individual demand curves. Before doing so, let's revise how we constructed the market demand curve for private goods. Recall case in that case that we added horizontally. That is, we summed up the total quantity demanded of all consumers at a given price to compute the market demand at that price. Exhibit 9.9 provides a summary example of a two-person market. Panel A contains your demand curve for pairs of jeans, and panel B contains Jim's demand curves for pair of jeans. For simplicity, both curves are drawn smoothly, even though it would be hard for you to buy 2.5 pair of jeans. At a price of $50, you demand 3 pairs and Jim demands 3 pairs. This leads to a total market demand of 6 pair at $50, as depicted in the panel C of the exhibit. Upon summing all the quantities demanded horizontally, we are left with the market demand curve in the panel C. Construction of the market demand curve for public goods follows similar logic. However, the nature of public goods, non-rivalry and non-excludability matters a great deal when moving from the individual to the market demand curve for public goods. Instead of summing horizontally, as in the case of private goods, the market demand for public goods is found by vertically summing the individual demand curves. This is necessary because the public goods is non-rival, so you and Jim can each consume every unit of the good at the same time. Therefore, to arrive at a market demand curve, we add the individual demand curves vertically because this gives us a measure of amount of money consumers are willing to pay for each unit of the public good. Let's put this intuition into action. Assume that we are again talking about you and Jim, but now we are considering the demand for space missions, a public good that potentially leads to new insight that will help all the mankind by unlocking the mysteries of space that are non-excludable and non-rival. For comparison purpose, assume that you and Jim have exactly the same demand curve for space missions as you had for jeans, again made smooth for simplicity. Exhibit 9.10 shows that your demand curve for space missions in panel A, Jim's in panel B, and the market demand curve for the public good in the panel C. At each level of public good provision, the market demand curves tell us how much the market would be willing to pay for an additional unit of the public good. As you can see, because you value the first space mission at $70 and Jim also values it at $70, the total marginal benefit for this first space mission trip is $140, as shown in panel C. This is called the market demand for one unit because it is the total amount of money consumers are willing to pay for the first unit of public good. Likewise, you value the third space mission at $50 and Jim values it at $50. Therefore, marginal benefit to the society of this third space mission is $100, as shown in panel C. In other words, prices are summed at each quantity level on the individual demand curves to derive the market demand curve for public goods. To compute exactly how much of the public good the government should provide, the supply marginal cost curve or space mission must be plotted alongside the market demand curve for space missions. We do this in exhibit 9.11. To compute the equilibrium level of space mission, we follow the decisions principles discussed earlier. We should expand the number of missions until the marginal benefit equals to the marginal cost, which occurs at q optimal in exhibit 9.11. At this point, total surplus is maximized because all of the gains in the market are reaped. This is because quantity demanded equals to quantity supplied, or marginal benefits equal to marginal cost. In the next chapter, we explore the different ways in which the government can raise funds to pay for public goods such as space missions. Choice and consequences. The free rider's dilemma. Imagine that you and 9 other students walk into an economics lab experiment with the hope of earning some cash. The moderator gives you each of you $10 and explains that you can anonymously and simultaneously contribute any portion of it and back to a public good or group account. The contributions collected will be doubled and then redistributed equally among you and the 9 other students. For example, if you each contribute half of your endowment of $5 to the group account, it then contains $50, that is 10 into $5. After the doubling, that would mean that $100 is to be split equally between all the 10 players. In the end, you walk away with $15, $10 from the group account, and $5 you opted not to put in the group account. How much of your $10 would you contribute? It is clear that to maximize the group's take home earnings, everyone should contribute the full $10 to the group fund. This would increase the total money earned in the experiment from 100 to $200 or $20 per person. Why? Then do the experiment show that contributions average less than $2 with around half of participants contributing nothing. For the group, the marginal benefit of contributing outweighs the marginal cost of contributing. But for the individual, that isn't the case. If you give $1 to the group and then the group as a whole receives $2, a marginal benefit of $1, but you yourself are only guaranteed 20 cents of that dollar back. That is, by contributing that $1 to the group, you cost the group account you cost yourself 80 cents. Armed with this knowledge, you can see that you can maximize your take home earnings by contributing nothing to the group account. Let's walk through a simple illustration. Let's just assume that everyone else contributes everything to the group account. And what are your payoffs if you contribute nothing versus contributing everything? Contribute zero payoffs. $10 plus $90 into 2 divided by 10 is equal to $28. Contribute everything payoff. $0 plus $100 into 2 divided by 10, $20. As you can see, by free riding and contributing nothing to the public good, you are $8 better off versus when you contribute everything. Because the same incentives are alive in the real world when it comes to public good, it is not surprising that many of us are free riders. Private provision of public goods. Over breakfast, you might listen to National Public Radio. If so, you likely have learned about the rainforest of Borneo, Indonesia, or the Amazon, which are being purchased by private organizations as an attempt to preserve them from being clear cut, or perhaps you have heard about recent breakthroughs of researchers working to cure cancer. Each of these activities and many more that provide private goods with positive externalities or provide public goods are funded by private sources. Although governments importantly provide public goods, they are not the sole providers. Many public goods are routinely provided through other channels such as private donations, which are indeed an effective way to provide public goods. Private provision of public goods refer to any situation in which private citizens make contribution to the production of or maintenance of a public good. There are many avenues for such provisions, but the most important is through private donation of time and money. For example, through private donations, NPR is provided all around the United States. Globally, rainforests are being saved through private cash donations to the World Wildlife Funds. Cures for ailments ranging from carpal tunnel syndrome to heart disease have been made in part from individual donating dollars for research funds. So, what is the scope of private donation of money? Exhibit 9.12 shows the tremendous growth in the charitable giving in the United States over a 40-year period. Since 1971, individual contribution to charitable causes have increased from roughly $125 billion annually to approximately $300 billion per year by 2011. Even though the recent giving levels already represent an important fraction of our economy, experts predict that the combination of increased wealth and the aging population will lead to even higher level of giving in the coming years. But there is more to the world than just the United States. How does giving in the United States compare to the giving rates in other countries around the world? We must be careful when making such comparisons. Differences could arise because some countries use taxes to fund more public goods than others. In this case, all else being equal, we should expect low tax countries to have fewer public goods provided by the government and more public goods provided by the charitable giving. Likewise, many people volunteer time to a charitable cause rather than give money. With such considerations in mind, we consider one of the most comparable data sets across the countries. In 2010, the polling company Gallup asked people all over the world one simple question: have you donated money to a charity in past month? Exhibit 9.13 shows that a majority of people answered yes in developed countries. Even in underdeveloped countries, the proportion of the people giving is above 10%, suggesting that donations to charity are an important phenomenon all over the world. You might be thinking that considering the voluntary nature of giving, this form of public good provision might be preferred to governments providing public goods. But we should be careful with this line of reasoning because there might be certain important public goods such as national defense or local weather alerts that will be considerably underprovided if left to private sources. As an example can help us understand the danger of leaving public good provision entirely in the hands of private market. Many scientists believe that species are currently going extinct at a faster rate than at any time in the history of our planet, with the exception of cataclysmic encounters such as collisions and extraterrestrial objects or massive volcanic eruptions. To deal with these problems, hundreds of conservation groups have been formed with the help of private donations. Which types of species do you think their donors are most likely to help? The answer, interestingly, is that the charismatic species and those that most resemble humans, such as panda bears or monkeys, receive the most support. If such fundings occur at the expense of funding keystone species that play an important role in the ecosystem, it will be dangerous for the vitality of our ecosystem. Of course, the government is not perfect, and either, and we return to this very issue in the next chapter. 9.5 Common Pool Resource Goods. Another important class of goods that are related to public goods are common pool resource goods. As summarized in the exhibit 9.8, common pool resource goods are not excludable, so anyone can consume as much of them as they can find. For example, urban parking places, coral reefs, and hamburgers at a student picnic. Unfortunately, common pool resources are rival goods, meaning that every Diet Coke that Jack drinks at the student party results one less Diet Coke for another's to drink. This leads to an important negative externality for that Jack imposes on all others. The externality involved with a common pool resource arises because of the combination of open access and depletion through uses. When deciding how much to fish in a lake, for example, people using the lake consider only their own private marginal costs of use. But this use depletes the resource for everyone. This is a classic negative externality. Individual use too much of the resource because they do not consider how others are affected. This results in analogs to the free market equilibrium quantity being higher than the optimal equilibrium quantity in earlier examples of negative externalities. Because everyone accessing the lake creates this same externality with their own use, the total use of the lake is above what is socially optimal. Other examples abound in the world around us. Too much water is extracted from aquifers. Too many trees are cut on the public lands. Too many communication devices jam airwaves. Too many donuts are eaten by one individual from the office donut box, and so on. Such overuse can result in the tragedy of commons, which occurs when a common resource is used too intensely. In some cases, the consequences of this overuse can be severe. Instead of preserving the sustainable fishery, for example, complete populations and even whole species can be destroyed by overfishing. It's not that fishermen prefer to drive their prey to extinction. In fact, they obviously would prefer a vibrant population. But depletion of this can result because of the presence of negative externality. In this case, too many users of the resource. Solutions to the tragedy of commons are similar to those discussed earlier in the chapter for some types of externalities. These interventions can be used by governments or other organized public or private regulatory bodies. For example, a Pigouvian tax can be applied to every fish that is taken out of Lake Michigan, or because users of common pool resources have incentives to join together to self-regulate use of the resource, it might be possible for people to organize an ecosystem that implements a maximum catch in any given year. When feasible, outright privatization of resources, turning its control over to a single owner, can also work. Ownership eliminates the externality problem because any depletion from use is borne by the owner, who controls access to the resource. It gives the owner incentives to regulate access in a way that maximizes the resource's values to the owner. Because efficient use of resources creates the biggest pie for the owner, that is, maximize what users are collectively willing to pay to access it. The owner has the incentive to encourage an efficient level of use. Choice and consequences. Tragedy of the commons. In medieval times, property rights were poorly defined. Typically, royalty controlled all the property and through arcane mechanisms and was divided up for use. The fact that the market was not allowed to act led to some bizarre practices, perhaps none as famous to social scientists as the management of feeding livestock. Livestock were the livelihood of any community offering dairy and meat, but this came at a cost, namely, livestock had to be fed typically by grazing the land, and those who owned livestock were frequently required to feed them in a common patch of land. This reliance on the common land led to the perverse incentives. In particular, the owners of livestock could purchase an extra goat or cow and reap all the rewards privately. That extra livestock had to graze somewhere, though, and the cost of lost grazing land was borne equally by all in the community. Thus, the common grazing area would slowly but surely be overused. This phenomena became known as the tragedy of commons, a term popularized by the ecologist Garrett Hardin. But the example of livestock overgrazing common land comes from a 19th century essay by the early British economist William Foster Lloyd. What makes the tragedy of the commons so tragic isn't just the economic inefficiencies, it's that at extreme, the owners of livestock could one day find themselves with nowhere to feed their animals because of overgrazing. The same perverse incentive structure work in many real work in many real world situations. Can you name some? What economics tool can be used to solve the tragedy of commons? Choice and consequences. The race to fish. Imagine that you are a fisherman who owns a private pond fully stocked with 100 bluegill fish. Because you own the property rights of the pond, you are the only one who can fish at the pond. Therefore, you can catch as many as bluegill as you want. But you know that in the late spring in 70-degree Fahrenheit water, the female deposits around 40,000 eggs in a shallow nest near the sandy shore. 2 or 6 days later, the eggs hatch and the male guards and the young fry during their first days. Knowing this, how many fish will you catch? You will likely not decide to catch all the bluegill instead of leaving many in the pond to restock your supply for the next season. Now imagine that this pond is a common pool resource. Anyone and everyone can fish from it. And one more fish on another angler's line means one less fish on yours. Would you still be careful to leave a lot of fish in the pond for the next season? Both real world situation and lab experiment conducted by Nobel laureate Eleanor Ostrom have shown us that you have probably wouldn't. After all, if you decide to leave, say 50 fish in the pond, who is to stop another fisherman from catching those fish? This line of thinking may lead everyone to keep fishing until there is absolutely nothing left. As you just learned, this type of situation is referred to the tragedy of commons, a dilemma in which multiple individuals acting in their own self interest deplete a shared limited resource when in the long run it isn't in anyone's best interest to do so. How might the fishermen in our example prevent this from happening? Section 9.5, Evidence Based Economics. How can the Queen of England lower her commute time to Wembley Stadium? In the late 1990s, traffic became so congested in central London that travel times dipped below the 19th century average. Before the introduction of the car, elected on a reformist platform, London's mayor vowed to make a strong play for fixing London's traffic woes once and for all. As we learned in this chapter, the basic theory behind externalities is straightforward. If there is a negative externality that you wish to solve, a Pigouvian tax can internalize the externality. In this case, the negative externality is that drivers enter the road without regard to how their presence is affecting others. Thus, a Pigouvian tax can help lessen the congestion problem. This may sound simple, but translating economic theory to the real world can sometimes be challenging. One problem to be solved in London was how to charge for use of the roads. Simple toll booths can often create just as many traffic jam as they are tasked to prevent. Another question to answer was that what size of the tax should be. London settled for a daily flat charge of £5 per day, although this was later increased to £10 per day with hybrid vehicles paying no tax. This fee was called a congestion charge. Although one might argue that instead of a daily usage tax, the government should have charged a mileage based tax. Policymakers decide that for the sake of simplicity, they would charge a daily usage tax. And to avoid creating unnecessary congestion, the daily charge would be enforced with the use of video cameras at roads on the outside of the city. Drivers would have to buy a daily pass at retail outlets, online, or with their cell phones, and drivers caught without having a daily pass were charged heavy fines. How did it all turn out? Exhibit 9.14 provides some summary details, comparing traffic patterns the year before the congestion charge was implemented to the year after. Total traffic have been reduced by 12%, and this gain was mostly due to the lower automobile traffic. All in all, economists estimated that the congestion charges had uh, reduced traffic circulating in the city center by 15% and the entering the zone by 18%. Also important in analyzing the benefits of the policy was its impact on the reliability of travel or the variability of travel time, which improved by an average of 30%. As Exhibit 9.14 shows, the introduction of congestion tax had an effect on increasing the use of public transportation. As drivers became discouraged from driving to the city because of the congestion charge, they began relying on buses. In addition, more people chose to travel by bicycle. All in all, the program has been a huge success. The Queen of England can now get to Wembley Stadium to watch a Rolling Stones concert in a more timely fashion. If mayors of American cities would like to achieve a similar success, they might wish to take London as an example. But they should be aware of the political landmines they will face along the way. A similar plan was put forward by the New York City Mayor Michael Bloomer, who proposed to introduce congestion pricing in Manhattan. The plan was greeted with much resistance as it was blocked by the New York State legislature, and with the Mayor Bloomer's retirement, the congestion tax is no longer being considered. In the next chapter, we dive deeper into the government taxation and learn why the taxes have their critics. Summary: the three major examples of when the invisible hand fails are externalities, public goods, and common pool resources. In each case, free markets typically do not maximize social surplus. Externalities comes in many shapes and sizes. They can be either positive or negative and can occur in consumption or production. The solution to externalities can come through private or public means. The key of each is internalizing the externality. In so doing, we can align private and social incentives so that we can maximize overall well being. Public goods, which can be provided publicly or privately, are non rival in consumption and are non excludable. This means that once they are provided, no one can be excluded and we all can consume them at the same time. Common pool resources. Goods are not excludable but are rival. This leads to an important negative externalities that one person imposes on all the others. Once the bluegill is taken out of the stream, no one else can catch it. Therefore, solutions to common pool resources problem mirror solutions to externality. A key link between externalities, public goods, and common pool resources is that there is a difference between private benefits and cost and the social benefits and costs. Questions. First, why are the externalities called market failures? Are pecuniary externalities also an example of market failure? Second, explain whether the following examples are examples of externalities. A. Alicia did not sleep well because her neighbor was playing loud music. B. Rochelle was late for a job interview because her alarm did not go off. C. Joe's was who is allergic to pollen is sick from the flowers that grows in his garden. Third, education is considered a good consumer good with positive externality in which the other non-consuming parties in the society also tend to benefit from it. Why does the invisible hand fail to generate socially efficient outcome in the education market? Fourth, what does it mean to say that an individual or a firm has internalized and externalities? Fifth, what is the cost theorem? Under what condition will the cost theorem break down? Sixth, how does a command and control policy differ from a market based policy? Seventh, what are the pecuniary taxes and subsidies? How do governments decide to levy a tax or provide a subsidy? Eighth, To provide national security for a country, the supplier needs to hire soldiers and acquire weapons and other military equipments. Do you think it is possible for a private firm to supply national security services efficiently? 9. Compare and contrast a private good and a club good. 10th, why is it difficult for the market to deliver socially efficient quantities of good like clean air or street lighting? 11th, when does the free rider problem arise? 12th, how does the market demand curve for a private good differ from that of a public good? 13th, what is meant by the tragedy of commons? Use an example to explain your answer. Problems. First, the European Union banned certain pesticides for 2 years after the studies found link between the use of these insecticides and a decline of the bee population. In particular, research has shown that the use of imidacloprid, clothianidin, and thiamoxidin on flowering crops have adversely affected the honeybee population in the North America and Europe. A. Consider the private market for these pesticides. Use supply and demand curves to show the equilibrium level of pesticide that will be produced and consumed. B. How might the impact of insecticides on honeybees be modeled as a marginal external cost? Show the deadweight loss from this externality in the graph you drew for the first part of this question. C. Is the private market outcome socially efficient? Second, suppose that you put an invisible tracking device on your computer that will instantly lead police to if your computer is ever stolen. Does your purchase of the tracking device provide a positive or negative externality for other computer owners? What kind of externality do you provide for the other computer owner when you purchase a visible computer lock in order to prevent theft? Third, to improve the public transportation in Singapore, the government has decided to construct the Circle Line (CCL), a mass rapid transit (MRT) project comprising many stations in the central region of the country. This is a huge infrastructural project and involves digging and pounding in the residential areas, resulting in noise, dust, and traffic congestion in the vicinity. Many residents have complained to the construction company that the project has led to pollution and inconvenienced them. Explain what type of externalities has occurred and why the Coase theorem is unable to rectify this issue. 4. Serena is a dance instructor who tends to play music very loudly at her home while practicing. Her neighbor Jennifer is a teacher who needs a quiet environment to mark her students' assignments. Dancing gives benefits to Serene worth 120 rupees daily, but Jennifer's marking progress is affected and it costs her $50 every day. A. Is it efficient for Siren to stop dancing with loud music on since it's inconveniences for Jennifer? B. If Serene has the right to do whatever she chooses, but both parties can negotiate with no cost involved, will Jennifer be able to mark assignments in a quiet environment? C. Jennifer has the right to a quiet environment and Serene can only play music loudly with Jennifer's approval. Assume that both parties can negotiate with no cost involved. Will Jennifer be able to mark the assignments in a quiet environment? Fifth, the government of a country Alpha imposes an entry charge of $3 on each vehicle using the expressway to control the traffic volume. But to no avail, the road is still not avail the road is still heavily congested. Explain why the government did not raise the charge to further reduce the number of vehicles on the expressway. Sixth, malaria is spread by the mosquitoes. That is, a mosquito spreads malaria by biting an infected person and later infusing malaria into a different person. A study by Jeffrey Sachs and others show a strong correlation between the incidence of malaria in a country and poverty. Malaria is known to exist in poor countries. It has also been found that the incidence of malaria exacerbates poverty. One of the simplest and effective ways to preventing the occurrence of malaria is by using insecticide treated nets. ITNs. A. Consider the private market for ITNs. Use supply and demand curves to show the equilibrium level of nets that will be produced. Is this outcome socially efficient? B. In the graph, how would you account for the ITN's effect on poverty? What happens to the level of output in the market? How could the government encourage the production of efficient number of ITNs? Seventh, certain diseases such as chickenpox are highly contagious. When a person is affected by chickenpox, their family members, colleagues, and people whom they regularly interact with stand at a high risk of catching the disease. The disease can be prevented by taking an injection of vaccine in local hospitals. This decision to take the vaccine is purely voluntary and some people choose not to go ahead with it due to the high cost involved. A. What type of externalities occur for vaccines against the contagious disease? B. Use a suitable diagram to show the market equilibrium quantity of the vaccine. Is the quantity also socially efficient? C. Suggest one method to achieve a socially efficient outcome. 8th, the US government recently raised its estimate of the social damage from greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide. Steel production generates a great deal of carbon dioxide. Present and discuss a diagram to help explain your answer to the following two questions. Two questions. A. Will the new higher estimate of social cost imply a higher level of or lower efficient quality quantity of steel? B. Will the new higher estimate of social cost imply a higher or lower level of the Piguvian tax required to lead to the efficient level of steel? Ninth. There is a road between the suburbs and downtown. The road is congested at rush hour. If 100 people use the road at rush hour, the trip takes 30 minutes. If the 101st person enters the road, everyone has to slow down and the trip now takes 31 minutes. People value their time at $6 per hour, that is $0.10 per minute. For simplicity, ignore all the cost of using the road other than the cost of time. A. What is the total social cost of 100 people using the road at rush hour? B. What is the marginal social cost of 101 first person? C. The governor of this state, who has taken a principles of economics course, would like to institute a toll that would be equal to the cost the last driver who uses the road imposes on the other drivers. How high should the toll be on this road during the rush hour? D. Suppose at noon 50 people are using the road. The road is not congested and the trip takes just 20 minutes. If the 51st driver enters the road, no one has to slow down and the trip continues to take 20 minutes. How high should the toll be at noon? 10th, Jack, John, and James are neighbors, and each of them has children. They are keen to have a playground in the vacant land adjacent to their house. The playground with the simple facilities such as a swing and a seesaw requires $6,000 to build. The playground is worth $5,000 to John, $2,500 to Jack, and $1,500 to James. A. Is it efficient to build the playground? B. Will any of the three parties build the playground on their own? C. The town council suggests that each one of them pay one third of the price to build the playground. It puts the matters to a vote and requires majority to vote in favor to implement it. Will the playground get built? 11th. Three roommates, Tinker, Evers, and Chance, share an apartment. It is really cold outside and they consider turning up the thermostat in the apartment up by 1, 2, 3, or 4 degrees. They know that each time they raise the temperature in the apartment by 1 degree, their bill will rise by $8. Their individual marginal benefits from making it warmer in the apartment are as follows: 1 degree for Tinker, $5, Evers $4, Chance $3. 2 degrees, Tinker $4, Evers $3, Chance $2. 3 degrees, Tinker $3, Evers $2, Chance $1. 4 degrees, $2 for Tinker, $1 for Evers, and $0 for Chance. They know that each time they raise the temperature by 1 degree, their heating bill goes up by $8. A. Find the marginal social benefit from making it 1, 2, 3, or 4 degree warmer. B. By how many degrees should they raise the temperature? 12th. Rhino poaching is a serious problem in South Africa, where a large proportion of Africa's rhino population is found. The demand for rhino horns used in traditional Chinese medicine has increased the prices of rhino horns substantially. This has fueled an illegal market for rhino horns. What economic tools can we use to solve this problem? 13th. In Horton Hears a Who by Dr. Seuss, Horton the elephant hears voices coming from a speck of dust. He soon learns that the speck is actually a tiny planet where the Who's live. None of the other animals in the jungle can hear the Who's, and they threaten to boil the speck in the bezel nut oil. The only way the Who's can save themselves is by making so much noise that the other animals in the jungle can hear them. Horton and the mayor of the Whoville have trouble convincing all the Who's to contribute to the noise making effort. Finally, a very small thinker, stricker named Jojo, joins in, and together all of the hosts make enough noise to avoid disaster. Dr. Seuss took two economics classes at Dartmouth College while he was an undergraduate. Do you think he did well in those classes?